Hi. Isaiah Berlin wrote that the fox knows many little things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. Well, Stephen Johnson knows many big things. Stephen Johnson is not only the author of books like Everything Bad is Good for You, Interface Culture, and Mind Wide Open, but he's also an entrepreneur and founder of early online communities. He founded Outside.in, a provider of hyperlocal news and information, as well as two influential websites, the pioneering webzine Feed and the community news discussion site Plastic.com. Emergence is not only a title of one of his books, but is also a theme throughout his works. The Ghost Map illustrates the emergence of public health, the invention of air, the emergence of science, and his latest book, Where Good Ideas Come From, The Natural History of Innovation, looks at the emergence of the new. Innovation is, of course, central to Google, and in his latest book, Stephen explores the space of innovation, observing the environments and networks from which good ideas emerge, from coral reefs to Building 20 at MIT. He debunks the myth of the lone genius suddenly struck by inspiration and instead dwells on all of the work that that genius builds on and connects to. And most importantly for Googlers, Stephen proposes 6 specific patterns that foster innovation within environments. So please join me in welcoming Stephen Johnson to the Authors at Google series.
Thank you, Mamie. It's great to be back at Google. It's always, you all are wonderful people to be around. I'm always inspired by the things that you do. So it's an honor to be back to talk about this new book. So I wanted to say I come here via Chicago, where I was talking on Wednesday night. But before that, I was in D.C. talking to some people in the government and did a very fun thing at the White House. But then on Tuesday, I was at this event talking about this book and these ideas in the intelligence community because they were doing a kind of a series on being more innovative and creative inside of bureaucracy. So they invited me to come and give this talk, and they they called me up and they said, listen, here's the deal. We have to send a special car to pick you up because the building where you're going to speak does not show up on Google Maps anywhere. Even in satellite view, you won't see it at all. So we have to take you to this kind of special, secure, undisclosed location, which sounded really intimidating. But then when I got there, it turned out it was great because there's very little Foursquare competition there. So I'm now the mayor of that of that location. Kit Cheney was the mayor before, but I kicked him out. Anyway, so it's nice to be in a slightly more open architecture environment. So I want to talk about this new book and talk a little bit about the arguments, and then talk a bit about some of the things that I think are happening, particularly with books and ebooks. And some of the things that you guys are on the cutting edge of right now. So I'm going to do a little bit of the book talk and a little bit of something custom tailored for this particular venue. One of the things I thought I would start by doing is telling you a little bit about how I got to this project. It actually dates back to a book that Mamie alluded to, which is a book called The Ghost Map, which I was here talking about 4 years ago. The Ghost Map is a story about a cholera epidemic in London in the 1850s. And I got interested in the story because it was one of those things that I kept kind of colliding with from different angles. So I'd be reading something about the history of science, and I would stumble across this story, and then I'd be reading something about interface design or cartography because there's a map at the center of it, and I would stumble across this story. Or I'd read about something in kind of the history of public health, and I would stumble across this story. And anytime there's some interesting kind of nugget of historical data or some perspective or person that you keep colliding with from different angles, it's always a sign that something interesting is going on. And so I decided to dig in a little bit more, and the story, as I heard it, went something like this. It's 1854 in London. The city, like many cities in Europe and in the United States, is being regularly attacked by this terrible disease of cholera. Every 5 years or so, a big epidemic will roll through the city. 5,000 people will die over the course of a summer. Nobody really understands it, but the reigning kind of orthodox theory about cholera is that it's in the air. It's the miasma theory was kind of the dominant model for understanding it. which was somewhat understandable because London was probably the smelliest city in all of the world at that particular point. And so people kind of naturally assumed that this noxious air that they were breathing had to be the culprit here. But in fact, we now know that cholera was in the water. It was not at all a problem of poisonous vapors. It was because the water supply was contaminated by this bacterium. So this outbreak kind of rips through the neighborhood of Soho in London in late August, early September of 1854. It kills 10% of the population in the space of about 10 days. And in the middle of all this, this kind of lone genius, this brilliant man, a local doctor named John Snow, kind of goes right into the belly of the beast of the outbreak and starts knocking on doors, investigating what's going on with this outbreak and calculating who has died at what address. And he builds this map. And the map shows the number of deaths at each address in the neighborhood with these little black bars. And when you look at the map, you can see very clearly that there's this very strong, pronounced cluster of deaths right around a popular pump at the center of Soho at 40 Broad Street. And you can see the further you get from the pump, the deaths kind of fade away. And so he looks at this map and he says, aha, the problem is with the water. It's not in the air. Cholera is a waterborne disease. If we can clear the water up of whatever this is causing this, we'll rid the city of this terrible menace. So he goes to the authorities, convinces them of his theory. They remove the pump handle. The epidemic stops. They start building things like the London sewers to clean up the water supply. And by 1866, cholera is gone from London forever. So I thought, that's a great story. It'll be like a Victorian episode of CSI. People will, it's got a page-turner kind of a feel, but it's a triumph of science and all this kind of stuff. So I started to really research it in earnest for this book, and what I found was, quite quickly, was that almost every important fact in that story that I just told you was wrong. And the first part of it was that Snow had the theory of cholera as a waterborne disease for 6 years before the outbreak came to Soho. He was convinced in late 1848 that in fact everybody was wrong about this disease, and in fact it was a waterborne problem, not an airborne problem. And he wrote a number of essays, wrote a number of letters to the Lancet. He actually created a couple of other maps, and basically his whole kind of theory was kind of roundly ignored by the authorities for a very long time. When the outbreak finally came to Soho, the map he made was actually not kind of triggering a eureka moment, a sudden moment of clarity in his head. It was in fact more of a marketing vehicle for an idea that he'd had for a long time, that he'd been working on for a long period of time. And it turned out also that Snow's kind of interest in all of this was actually really just a hobby that he had on the side. Most of us don't have cholera as a hobby, but Snow was that kind of guy. He was trained as a physician and an anesthesiologist, but he was interested in a million different things. And cholera was one of those things. And in fact, it turns out to be a trait of a lot of people that I look at in this new book, that unusually innovative people have a lot of hobbies. It's this very interesting kind of characteristic. And it turned out to be precisely because he did have a number of different hobbies and interests that it was the kind of interaction between all these different kind of passions that allowed him to see around a lot of the orthodoxies of the day and solve this riddle in a way that other medical authorities couldn't. But the most important thing that I found in researching this book was that Snow had a collaborator that no one had talked about. That was almost entirely written out of the historical accounts of this outbreak. And his collaborator was this guy named Henry Whitehead, who was a local vicar, not at all a man of science. He was one of these local vicars. He was kind of a classic connector-like figure who knew everyone in the neighborhood, had great kind of social intelligence. And he got kind of involved in the case initially actually to try and prove Snow wrong, which was kind of funny, and then became an ally of Snow's. And it was Whitehead who did a lot of the kind of shoe leather detective work, particularly in tracking down people who had left the neighborhood because he had these thick ties to them socially. And it was Whitehead who ended up tracking down the patient zero of the whole outbreak, which turned out to be crucial, in addition to the map, in convincing the authorities that Snow's theory was right. So what had been this kind of classic story of the kind of lone genius having a eureka moment of sudden clarity turned out to be a much slower, much more complex, and much more collaborative and networked kind of process than the story had originally been told to me. And I thought actually much more interesting. And so I realized as I was writing that book that there was, in a sense, a kind of a latent theory of innovation, of breakthrough ideas and the environments that make them possible, that was lurking in the background of this story I was telling about cholera. And so I decided to kind of make that story, that theory, front and center in a new book. And so I went to my publisher and kind of persuaded them that I should write a book about innovation and the spaces that encourage innovation. And early on, I decided that I would look not only at human societies and cultural environments, but also biological ones. And that there would probably be an interesting set of kind of analogies to draw between human innovation and biological innovation. And so I knew that I wanted to look at environments like rainforests and coral reefs that have a long kind of track record of generating biological diversity, because I figured there would be kind of patterns that you would see in both of them. The problem was then, when I actually sat down to kind of decide what would go into the book, I realized that I had set the scope of this project kind of ridiculously wide, right? Because it could include potentially any good idea that any human being had ever had in the course of human history, or any interesting life form that had ever evolved in the course of life on Earth, which when you're sitting, with Google search box open on your desktop and a cup of coffee in the morning is kind of daunting when, you can include everything like that. So I had to figure out, for a while I kind of panicked and thought that I had made a terrible mistake. But eventually what I realized is that I was seeing these kind of recurring patterns that were showing up again and again in the environments that I was looking at. And I decided that each chapter basically should be devoted to one of these patterns, and eventually kind of came up with 7 of them, really. There's kind of an introductory one that you can kind of count as one as not. And once I had that, it got a lot easier to write, because the patterns, in a sense, became like these magnets that would attract all these different stories to kind of the right slot. And then it became really fun. And then it was almost a question of, where do I stop? Because there was so much to say. And I wanted to talk a little bit about a few of them and tell you a little bit of my theory about them. The first is one that we've already seen in the case of snow. It's what I call the slow hunch. There seems to be this almost innate desire to tell stories about innovation in terms of eureka moments. For some reason, we just want to kind of condense them down to these moments of sudden clarity where a light bulb pops over someone's head and they suddenly, see the world differently. The apple falls from the tree and they have a theory of gravity, whatever the kind of trigger is. But when you actually go back and look at it, it turns out that the historical record is, in the historical record of innovation, eureka moments are the exception and not the rule. Almost always, there is a very long incubation period that goes into a breakthrough idea where people are they start with this kind of inkling, this sense that there's something interesting in a particular problem, a feeling that, the authorities are misunderstanding something or there's an opening, but they can't quite put their finger on it. And for whatever reason, they have patience, or they have a work environment, or they're just kind of stubborn, or they have good kind of tools that help them remember these things, and they're able to keep these hunches alive for long periods of time. This is a great example of this. I show this slide a lot. This room will probably guess what this is, because you can see in the upper left-hand corner it says CERN. It says, "This machine is a server, do not power down," right? So this is the first World Wide Web server that Tim Berners-Lee put together. This was back in the day when the World Wide Web was on one server, where you could trip over the power cord and be like, "Oh, I'm so sorry, the World Wide Web is down." Unfortunately, we've moved beyond that. But it's a famous story. But Berners-Lee, this is a classic instance of a slow hunch, right? He starts working at CERN in 1982 almost as a consultant, and he's kind of overloaded with all the information and projects and people who are there. And so he starts kind of working on this project he calls Inquire for a while. And then he kind of puts that aside, and a few years later he starts working on something called Tangle, which doesn't really take off. And then it's only 3 or 4 years later after that he starts working on something that he ends up calling the web. And of course he's basing it on existing platforms that are out there. He's basing it on the internet, of course, and parts of SGML and things like that. And it's only kind of 8 years after this hunch starts to be kind of cultivated in his mind that he finally goes to his bosses and says, "I think I may have invented a new global medium here. Could this be part of my day job, please?" Right? And I think it's in part because he didn't set out to invent a globally transformative communications platform in 1982 that he was ultimately able to do it. If he tried to do that from the beginning, it would have been too much. It would have been too ambitious. But because he started with this smaller, less ambitious project and kind of let it incubate for a long period of time, and because he had an environment and a certain sensibility that allowed that to happen, he was able to turn it into something that changed all of our lives and made this company possible. You often find, even in individual cases, people in telling the stories of their own innovations, they will kind of invent these eureka moments, even if it turns out they didn't really happen. So one great example of this is Darwin. For many years, the standard story of Darwin's discovery of the theory of natural selection was that he had this epiphany in his study late one night in October of 1838 when he was sitting around reading Malthus's book on population. And he writes about this in his autobiography. He actually kind of describes this, what scholars eventually called the Malthusian epiphany, where he's reading Malthus one night, and as he writes in the autobiography, suddenly the idea for the kind of algorithm of natural selection pops into his head. And he writes, "At last I had a theory with which I could work." And it sounded great. And he writes this in his autobiography. And for 100 years, that was the canonical story of the roots of evolutionary theory. But about 25 years ago, a really interesting scholar named Howard Gruber went back and read through all of Darwin's notebooks from this period. And Darwin kept these kind of wonderful notebooks, which were called in that period the commonplace books. And the whole kind of genre of the commonplace book is very interesting. Many commonplace books, which were crucial to the kind of explosions of intellectual activity in the Enlightenment in the 1700s and 1800s, what people would do with commonplace books is they would find interesting quotes and jot them down, kind of transcribe them, word by word in these commonplace books. And they would intersperse them with their own ideas and thoughts about the world and their various inquiries. And crucially, they would then go back and reread through these books. And so they would take all these different voices and different snippets and kind of remix them, intersperse them with their own ideas. And by rereading all these different voices, they would kind of give birth to their own intellectual sensibility of the world. Thomas Jefferson did this, John Locke did this, Darwin did this, Erasmus Darwin did this. And it was actually a really kind of crucial intellectual vehicle for the period, and I'll come back to that in a second. With Darwin, he kept these wonderful notebooks where he wrote a lot of his own ideas, as well as kind of borrowing quotes and things and doing sketches and stuff like that. And we have all these notebooks. So Gruber went back and read through all these notebooks. They're all chronologically organized very clearly. And what he found was there is, in fact, a moment of kind of excitement in late October of 1838 when Darwin is reading Malthus, and there are a lot of kind of exclamation points that night, and he's all excited. But what Gruber found was, in fact, there are many, many passages for months and months before the alleged epiphany, where Darwin writes out whole paragraphs that seem like they are taken straight from a contemporary evolutionary theory textbook, where he seems to have the whole theory of natural selection kind of in his head on some level. And then you have the epiphany, and the next day, there's no sense that he's, past this really important watershed point. Like, he's not like, I have solved my big problem. Like, he goes and writes an entry on the sexual curiosity of primates that has nothing to do with his big new discovery the night before. Like, he's had the most important idea in 19th century science, and he's like, the next morning, he's like, all right, I'm going to go do the crossword puzzle. There's no sense of some momentous thing has happened, right? And in fact, it's not for another 2 months before Darwin actually starts writing about his theory as this thing that he has, and he has to then figure out what he has to do with it, which he spends, of course, 20 more years trying to figure out. And so Gruber's point is, if you try and pinpoint the exact moment that Darwin has the idea, you can't do it. That you can say pretty confidently from the notebooks that he doesn't have it 3 months before the epiphany, and he clearly fully has it 2 months after. But when you try and get more precise than that, it's very blurry. It's really hard to kind of specify. And that's because the idea is not a single thing that happens in an instant. It's a much more evolutionary process, a much slower process. Now, when you think about the kind of process of innovation as something that is built around hunches and built around kind of ideas from other people kind of colliding and being remixed in other ways, it sets up, I think, a lot of different assumptions about the kind of tools that you use to make sense of these ideas and to keep track of them. So for many years, I've been using this piece of software. I think I may have talked about one of the times I was here in the past. That is called Think. How many people have seen Think? Anybody else? Yeah, a couple of folks have seen it. I should get royalties from these people. I think I've talked about this. It's kind of obscure German software company that makes this thing. It's Mac only, but I've been using it for a long time, and it is kind of my version of the commonplace book. Although I'm working on something that will be a little bit different that may replace this. For years, I've been keeping digital clips of quotes that I find useful from books, anticipating that software like this was going to come around. So initially, I would actually just take the book and I would type in the excerpts. I tried OCRing the books to get the text in there, which really never works very well. I had this amazing technology called a research assistant, which is fantastic, very accurate, and just a little more expensive than some of the other techniques to get the quotes in digital form. And now, of course, because of ebooks, it's getting easier and easier, although it's harder than it should be, which I will get back to get quotes from books and store them here. And so I've collected, I don't know what it is now, 6,000 kind of fragments from books and from web pages and various things that I found that I've been working on for basically 12 or 13 years. And so I've curated this commonplace book of interesting ideas that I don't know really where they're going to be useful or what they're going to be good for, but I've been storing them around and kind of porting them along from computer to computer. Now what Think does is it lets me store all that stuff, but basically lets me do kind of a pretty smart kind of semantic analysis of the text of these little snippets so that I can select one and say, show me things that are like this, right? So I use it sometimes as a straight search query where I'm like, I need to find that one passage about turtles, and so I search for turtles and I find it. But the interesting use that I have for it is that I use it in an improvisational way. Right, I use it in an idea association generating way as a kind of triggering tool, not just as a search and retrieval tool. And so I'll take a passage that I'm interested in and I'll say, show me other things that are like this, Think, and it'll give me this list of things. Sometimes I will write a passage in my own words and I will say, show me things that are like this passage that I've just written. Because the number of things, of course, that you've forgotten, that you've read, even things that you really loved and found interesting, is immense. You forget much, much more than you remember, right? So keeping this kind of outboard memory is extremely valuable to me. But what's crucial about it is that it's not everything. It's not everything I've ever read. It's not everything in every book that's ever been written. It's massively filtered by my own interests, my decisions to read a certain book, and then my decisions to pick these passages as being the most important ones. But it also has this kind of noise to it, right? It's not tremendously accurate. Oftentimes the number one result will be the next paragraph from that book that I've quoted at the beginning to start the search query. And I'm like, yes, Think, I know that passage is interesting. I just read it. And sometimes it'll be irrelevant. But the noise, the kind of surprise and serendipity that you get from the software suggesting things that are kind of off, but not totally off, has generated a number of kind of trains of association, some of which have led to entire chapters of books that I've written. And so there's a very interesting question, which of course you all wrestle with all the time, which is when I have that idea, when there's an idea suggested to me of an association between something I've read and something else I've read, and it leads to something as substantive as a chapter in a book, who's having that idea? Is it me or the software? Right? On some level, obviously it takes me to curate it. It takes my intelligence to curate, my intelligence to recognize that that's the valuable connection, and my intelligence to then build a whole chapter out of it. And that's important. I still have value in that chain, right? But I probably wouldn't have made the connection without the associative intelligence of the software. And so in a real sense, it's a duet between these two very different kinds of intelligence collaborating on new ways of thinking. So it's kind of the beginning of that kind of digital commonplace book, I think that could be so powerful if we keep working on this. But it's not just environments like software where ideas come together, where hunches can kind of collide with other hunches. I also spent a lot of time in the book looking at kind of physical environments. I've got some inside there. Physical environments that have been unusually innovative, real-world environments where people get together, where ideas get together. And I look at environments like office environments and cities and things like that. But one of my favorites, which I've now written about in a couple of books, is the coffee house of the 18th century. The coffee house, particularly in London and Paris and in Vienna and a little bit in in Boston and United States. The coffee house was a tremendous driver of innovation in this period, and just an amazing number of really world-changing ideas in science and in politics and in religion and in business, technology, have somewhere in their story a coffee house. And the question is, why? What is it about this space that made it so generative? What were the kind of core ingredients that made it so powerful? Now, one answer, which is important but a little bit off topic, is the fact that they were drinking coffee, right? I mean, this is not a trivial thing, right? Because until coffee and tea became kind of, affordable for mass audiences, the daytime beverage of choice for both mass and elite people was alcohol. It was the safe thing to drink because the water wasn't safe to drink. It was the healthy choice, basically. So people would wake up and they would have some beer with breakfast, and they would have a little more beer during the morning, and they'd have some wine at lunch. In the 1600s, they drank a lot of gin. Gin was the big craze in the 1600s. And so you really, truly had a population that was just drunk all day long. That was the kind of standard state of existence in society. And so it's sounds like a joke, but it's not an accident that when a society moves from a depressant to a stimulant in their daily intake, they're going to have better ideas as a society, right? It's going to happen. So for those of you who spend all day drinking alcohol, you should think about, one of the key takeaways of my talk is maybe you want to switch to coffee. But it wasn't just the coffee. What was so important about these environments is that they were hubs where different interests and passions and hobbies were able to kind of collide and connect with each other in surprising new ways, right? When Ben Franklin would hang out at the London Coffee House near St. Paul's, he would have this group called the Club of Honest Whigs. This is during the long period of time when Franklin was in London. And they would meet, every fortnight, and they would hang out and they would have these like 5-hour-long sessions where they would just talk about the American political situation and the science of electricity and new developments in chemistry and, business models and all this kind of stuff. And it was precisely because the space wasn't so structured. It wasn't an office environment. It wasn't a lecture. But it wasn't completely chaotic and disorganized. It was in this kind of middle zone that I call the liquid network, where ideas were kind of free to bounce off each other and collide and take these new forms. And it was the kind of multidisciplinary nature of the space that made it so powerful. In fact, I went back to London when I was writing this last book, The Invention of Air, to see if there was any plaque or anything. Because the London Coffee House was absolutely just an amazingly historic place for so many different reasons. And there's no record of it anywhere, except there is a Starbucks basically right where it used to be. So they're holding, keeping the torch alive basically in the memory of it. And so it's that kind of environment, that kind of liquid fluid environment where there's a lot of diversity in the points of view and in the hobbies of all the people there, that is so often the kind of generator of innovation. Now, in biological terms, there's a clear parallel here in terms of the importance of diversity and multidisciplinary thinking. It's like a somewhat awkward word, but I find it really useful. It's worth knowing. Originally coined by Stephen Jay Gould and Elizabeth Verba about 30 years ago in a paper about kind of the mechanisms of innovation and evolution. And their word for it is acceptation. And acceptation is the idea that there is a feature of some kind that is kind of sculpted by evolution for a certain purpose, that turns out when the environment changes for some reason or some kind of new possibility opens up, turns out to be good at something else that wasn't the original kind of point of that feature, of that trait. So the classic example is feathers, right? Feathers originally evolved, we think, for thermal regulation, for just keeping an organism warm. It turned out that some of the feather owners decided to adopt this crazy new lifestyle of flying, and the ones that had feathers were slightly better at it. And so after that point, feathers started to get sculpted by selection to be more aerodynamic. In fact, you can see a very clear difference in the feathers of flying birds versus non-flying birds, because the non-flying birds' feathers are perfectly symmetrical, which makes them less aerodynamic. So what Gould and Verba was saying is that that's a big driver of new kind of lifestyles and new features and new functionality in the evolutionary record, which is that things designed for one thing turn out to be good for some surprising new use down the line. It's not just driven by mutation, but it's driven by this kind of migration across different uses. So something is exapted for a new purpose. That's the way you kind of use that phrase. And it turns out that the history of technology is replete with examples of acceptation, right? I mean, think of all the ways in which the web has been accepted to do all these things that Tim Berners-Lee never dreamed of, right? That's so much of what we do in this business is take old things and put them to new uses that were not in the minds of their creators by any means. But it actually dates back to, early technologies. So when Gutenberg was coming up with the original technology of the printing press, he'd done this amazing work with movable type and with inks and had this kind of state-of-the-art technology because of his skills as a metallurgist. But he didn't actually have a kind of a pressing mechanism for all of this. And so he's missing this kind of key component. And so he's kind of stuck. And so it turns out to be grape harvesting season in Rhineland, Germany. So he goes up to the hills and decides to drink some wine because coffee wasn't available yet. And he's hanging out there, and one day he looks over and he sees this ancient technology, the screw press, which is being used to press grapes and has been around for 2,000 years. And he looks at it and he's like, ha, that's what I need. And so he exapps this very old machine designed to press grapes and kind of reconfigures it, remixes it, and turns it into a machine for printing Bibles. And so that kind of borrowing of ideas across their original uses and across disciplines is really a crucial part of the history of innovation. Now, this has an interesting implication, which is that there is kind of conceptual or creative value that comes from surrounding yourselves with a diverse set of influences. There was a really interesting study a number of years ago by a Stanford Business School professor named Martin Roif, who looked at unusually innovative people in corporate America and entrepreneurs, and looked at their social networks, like not their Facebook, Twitter networks, but the people that they actually know, and went and then compared their social networks to folks who were, to put it nicely, less innovative in their careers, which is, by the way, the part of the experiment you don't want to be asked to participate in. When they call you up and say, "You seem very dull. Could we talk to you a bit about your friends?" Don't answer the phone, right? So Roif looks at all these things, and what he finds is that unusually innovative people have this very distinct pattern in their social networks, which is that they have strong and weak tie connections to a much more diverse range of professions, right? So they work in an ad agency, but they're friends with an architect and a web developer and a popular science writer and a government contract writer, a lawyer and a plumber. Whereas the less innovative people are just friends with other people who work in ad agencies. And what I think that shows is, in a sense, the power, the creative power of acceptation. You're an architect and you're talking to your web developer friend, and there's something in the way that the web developer deals with his kind of workflow that turns out to be really interesting. If you port it over into architecture, it does something new, and it gets you out of your kind of conventional ways of thinking about the world. And so where you end up when you think about things that way is, it's in a sense the non-political argument for diversity. It's not that we'll be better as a society and more tolerant as a society if we surround ourselves with people who are different for us. That is certainly true. But also that we'll be smarter on some level. We'll be more original in our thinking if we surround ourselves with people who have different interests. And that's part of the reason why people with hobbies are so innovative in their careers. It's because hobbies, in a sense, give you that kind of coffee house environment even when you're by yourself, right? Because you're constantly kind of bouncing back and forth between different kinds of projects and different interests. One of the things that happened after Gutenberg is the printer and the printer's workshop it was kind of the coffee house of this period. This is one of Gutenberg's original kind of disciples who went on to, it's Peter Schiffer, who went on to become actually the first kind of financially successful printer, because Gutenberg was like a disaster as a businessman. But Schiffer built this kind of printing business, and it became this really interesting hub where all these different people from the community, you had religious people coming to talk about the Bibles, you had technology people who wanted to help build the machines, you had kind of businessmen who were coming in to think about investing in this, and you had the kind of secular intellectual groups, such as they were, the proto-scientists and things like that, hanging out because this is where the ideas were. And so you had this interesting kind of hub that was created by this technology, but supported this interesting kind of space of diversity that led to kind of the early, kind of late Renaissance, early Enlightenment stuff that the book unleashed. Now, one of the things that Schiffer did in the years after the first printing presses were created it's a wonderful period to study, and there have been a bunch of interesting things written about it. Clay Shirky has written about it a little bit and talked about it recently. Because in a sense, what happens between all these early printers is that they have this kind of feature war that breaks out where they're printing new books and they're talking about their new books that they're doing, but they also start innovating in terms of the kind of features included in their books. So they start saying, hey, we've got a new index, or we've got this new way of kind of organizing the pages, or we've got this new supplementary material. And literally the language they use sounds a lot like the language we use to describe new software features. So this right here is this edition of St. Augustine's On the Art of Printing, which was published in 1467, I think it was. And it is, we believe, the first printed book to have an alphabetized index. You can see it's alphabetical down the side. They don't actually have page numbers that work. We didn't have Arabic page numbers for another 100 years. It didn't become standardized. But this idea of alphabetizing all these things, that you could go and find things in some fashion, was this big innovation. And Schoeffer's kind of description of the book actually included this plug that said, you know, the index is worth the price of the book alone. It makes it much more easy to use. So it's like, it's user-friendly. You should adopt this book because of these new features we have. It's got a great interface for finding the information. This is, 15th century search technology right here is what you're seeing. Now, what's cool about this is the idea that they were kind of competing, although the problem is each new feature would come out every 20 years. So it was it was an arms race, but it was a very slow arms race between all the competing printers. But when all of these things coalesced, when you developed page numbers, when you had alphabetical indexes, when you created a system of kind of citation and footnotes and all that kind of stuff, and a reliable way of storing these books, that became a platform that sustained alongside the coffee house a lot of the great, amazing, extraordinary, world-changing innovations of the Enlightenment, because you had a whole system of agreeing on where the information was and how to point to it. Right? There was a whole standardized way of saying, here's this idea that somebody has, and now I'm going to build on top of that idea, and we've agreed on a way to kind of figure out where it is, what its address is, and how we point to it. And it was from these early innovations kind of coming together to form this standardized platform that then everybody adopted, basically, in terms of scientific reference. It became one of the key architectural kind of frameworks that made the Enlightenment possible. So you know the parallel here, right? You know where I'm going with this, right? This is exactly what Berners-Lee did, exactly what this business was built around, this world-changing consensus of agreeing where the information lives and how to point to it. That created a platform that enabled this company and enabled millions of other businesses and nonprofits and amazing innovations that have happened because we had this kind of standard agreement about where information was and how to get people to it. Right? Now, the question is, what is happening now with that agreement and that platform? And that's really what I want to just say a couple of words about, and then we can answer some questions, and I'm happy to sign books. Because, there was this big article that Chris Anderson did, The Web is Dead, and all this talk about apps and things like that. And the truth is, I'm not so worried about the app world, because there's a lot of what's happening in apps that is not necessarily, we don't necessarily need to have it be linkable in the way that we have a lot of, nobody needs to link to one particular screen of Angry Birds. I think that's all right if we lose the ability to point to that information, right? But there is information that is going to be kind of built and stored in the app world that will be unlinkable, or that we haven't kind of figured out a way to kind of make it linkable. But more importantly, there is a massive influx of information, and really the best information in the world, that is coming online at an incredible speed, or becoming digital at an incredible speed because of ebooks, right? My last book, I think 2% of the copies we sold were in ebook format. This book will sell 20 to 25% in ebooks, right? And then 2 years, we've had 2% to 20%. So this is actually a faster wave than I think we saw with the original web in 94, 95, 96. It's really extraordinary. And right now, all that information is digital, so it should be part of this whole world and part of this platform. It should be the ideal mechanism for creating commonplace books. It should be a fantastic mechanism for going in and pointing to things and citing them and building platforms and doing all the amazing things that we've done on the web and open up all the space for innovation on the web. We should be able to do that with the world's best information, the information that's stored in books. but it's not quite working right the way it is now. We don't fully agree on a standard of how you kind of cite a particular point in a book, right? The Kindle has locations. They've done away with page numbers altogether. You can point to a particular page in a Google Book Edition online, and that can kind of work, but that's not the standard kind of reference URL for that page. And being able to move text around and grab a quote and put it somewhere else, put it in a D1 Think, share it, send it to a friend, is very complicated. The new Google Book Reader, as far as I can tell, does not allow you to copy text at all in any form. I may be wrong about that, but it seems, from my experiments with it over the last 2 days, it doesn't seem like you can actually select text and copy it. And it seems to me, and I understand why, publishers and authors guilds, I'm going against my constituency here in saying this, but I know that the publishing industry is the driving force behind this, and they're saying, no, we don't want to have another Napster for books, and they're all concerned about words getting out there. But it seems to me at a certain point, the whole point of having digital text is that you can do stuff with it. You can move it around, you can take it into new environments, you can borrow it and repurpose it and remix it in all these different ways. And when we have software that keeps you from actually being able to just select a paragraph and paste it somewhere else, that's not a feature we'd like to have or something that would be nice to have. Like that's almost an inalienable right of digital text in this age, right? Copy and paste within limits, right? Put limits on it and say you can only copy and paste 10% of this book. That's fine. We can establish those things. Fair use limits is perfectly appropriate. But to not allow it at all, to have the words in a sense behind glass there where you can't touch them and move them around, I think is a great mistake, because we have this wonderful opportunity to build a new platform with a whole new trove of information that's out there. And so, to me, the overarching kind of message of this book is that we've spent a lot of time historically thinking about new ideas and innovation in terms of the importance of protecting those ideas, keeping them locked up in R&D labs, wrapping them around intellectual property laws and patents as best as we can, and making sure that they're hidden away so that they're valuable. But I think what happens when you look at the history of innovation from the perspective of these different patterns, both in the online world and the history of science, even in the history of nature, is that we do ourselves a disservice if we only emphasize the protective side of information. And that in fact there is oftentimes more value and more creativity that comes from connecting ideas, making those new links, and building platforms that make those connections easy to make. Thank you very much for listening. Okay, we got a few minutes for questions about any of this stuff. If anybody is working on the ebook side, I would love to hear what you are thinking of. I'd like to learn, take this opportunity to steal some ideas from you all. Yeah?
I was interested by your...
Oh, great.
Okay, so I was interested in your discussion of the feature wars in the early days of printing with movable type.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about any innovative features introduced in that time that didn't work out and that we don't remember today?
Oh, that's a really good question. That's a great way of approaching it. I'm trying to think if there's anything that jumps to mind. I do think one of the things I'm really interested in terms of the history of ideas is that kind of reverse history, where we tend to, tell the history of the winners, and it's just as important, I think, to look at two different kinds of losers. I'm going to give a theoretical answer because I can't think of a good concrete example. There are two different kinds of losers that are worth studying. The first is the good idea that failed. Right. So in the book, one of the things I talk about, I'm sure this is familiar to most of the people in this audience. One of the most fascinating stories in the history of technology is, of course, Charles Babbage basically inventing the computer, the kind of digital computer, in the middle of the 19th century with Ada Lovelace, the first programmer, Lord Byron's daughter, helping him. it's such a cool story because he was literally 100 years kind of ahead of his time, which almost never happens, right? It's amazing how reliably kind of ideas come at the right time. People rarely jump 100 years ahead. And what Babbage was trying to do is build a programmable computer with steam industrial era parts. He was trying to build a steam-powered programmable computer, and you just couldn't do it, right? So that's one way in which, and his idea, as visionary it was, it was so far ahead of its time that it kind of died out, and most of the principles had to be rediscovered 100 years later when people started to actually build computers with vacuum tubes and so on. So there are ideas that fail because they're good, but they're just ahead of their time in some kind of way. The other question is ideas that, in a sense, are bad ideas that stick around for too long. This is a big thing that I think intellectual historians should spend more time on, the history of being wrong. Because no doubt we're all walking around with our own kind of biases or misunderstandings of the world that 30 years from now or 100 years from now we're going to go, how were we so stupid, right? And trying to figure out how those ideas have historically stayed in place for such a long time. That's in the ghost map, the theory of the miasma theory, the cholera being the air is one of those. Like, why did it stick around for as long as it did? I think is a really interesting kind of problem. So to totally fail to answer your question, but hopefully say something interesting, that I think that going back and looking at innovations that failed either because they were wrong or poorly designed but interesting, or innovations that were so good that people couldn't deal with them yet on some level. That's a really fertile field of discovery. Go ahead.
I'd be interested in your take on a classic question from the history of technology, which is are innovations inevitable?
Right.
Or meaning the ideas come together and there's someone who just puts them together in the right way? Or is it a matter of genius and a matter of an individual's contribution, seeing things that are maybe apparent to others, but who they fail to put together?
Yeah, it's a great question. By the way, another fantastic book that deals with this, maybe even a little bit more, although I talk about it, is Kevin Kelly's book, What Technology Wants. I'm sure Kevin has been here or is coming here. Yeah. 2 weeks ago, there you go. Kevin and I, we did a fun event at the New York Public Library, which is online actually, and we talked about this quite a bit. There's a term for it, which is the multiple, right? In the kind of history of science and technology, where there again and again there are these multiple independent discoveries or inventions of basically the same thing, happening without direct interaction between the participants, and there are like 150 of them in the kind of canon of big ideas that are out there and have been collected. And, historically it's been kind of described in this very kind of vague zeitgeisty kind of way, like something was just in the air, And I think that, in saying that these ideas on some level are inevitable, that you reach a certain point and someone will figure out how to build a personal computer, a digital computer, a phone, is true. It doesn't mean there aren't geniuses, right? It doesn't mean that this book is not against the idea that some people are, by nature of their genes or their education, and probably some mix of that, some people are smarter than other people. So whoever it is who gets to discover that thing at that particular moment of time, it's going to be more likely to be someone who's smart and well educated than someone who's not. But it's very, very hard for someone to have that insight at the wrong time, right? It's impossible to invent a microwave oven in 1650. It just cannot be done, right? There are just limitations of it. So the example that's very close to my heart is in The Invention of Air. The hero of that book is Joseph Priestley, who is most famous for isolating oxygen for the first time, kind of known as the discoverer of oxygen, although when he did it, he called it dephlogisticated air instead of oxygen, which was not a very good brand and didn't really stick. And it turned out that actually two other people, Lavoisier and Steele, the Swedish, I believe, scientist, also kind of isolated oxygen within about a year. Some between 1772 and 1774, three people more or less independently kind of isolate oxygen for the first time. So weird, huh? Right? How did that happen, right? But when you go back and look at it, you realize that there are a set of kind of supporting platforms that basically make that thought thinkable for the first time right around that period. And some of it is technology, right? One of the key things that they had is they developed in the 1750s very accurate scales. And part of the way that they could figure out that oxygen was something is that when you burn things, they got ever so slightly heavier, right? Because of combustion. And so, but you couldn't pick that out if you didn't have really, really precise scales. And the other thing they had was they discovered vacuums about a century before. And up until the discovery of a vacuum, people never thought of the air as being something you'd study. It was just this empty space between things. If you were going to use this great new scientific method, you wanted to study a tree or a body or a rock, but why would you study the stuff between all those things, right? But then they figured out that there was this thing called a vacuum, which seemed to look just like air, but not be air. And so it suddenly suggested this idea that there was something between us all that we could study. So without unlocking that as a kind of a paradigm that you could get interested in, you couldn't even start to solve the problem. So I think what happens is, there are these stages, and the technology advances, the perspectives advance, and they unlock a whole new set of possibilities. In the book, I call this the adjacent possible, which is a phrase from Stuart Kauffman. And then who actually explores the adjacent possible? Some of it is luck, some of it is environment, some of it is education, some of it is kind of skills, mental skills, curiosity. But there are many, many doors that can't be unlocked until you get to the next level, which is suddenly sounding like a video game. But anyway, that's the video game theory of scientific creativity. All right. We probably have a little bit of time. Yeah?
So this isn't exactly a question about your book, but I was wondering if you could say a little biographical background. What led you to write about the things that you've written about, and to have the entrepreneurial experiences that you've had? What's your background?
Yeah, sure. Well, it's very funny because I'm more often than not described as a science writer, which is hilarious because I have no scientific training whatsoever. My parents are still like, we saw your biology grades in high school. Like, this is ridiculous. What's going on? But my background is actually kind of media theory, and then I did graduate work at Columbia in English literature, actually. And I studied kind of the 19th century metropolitan novels. So I spent a lot of time on kind of the cultural history of London and the city. So some of Ghost Map is out of that. But I'd always had kind of a technology interest. And so when I was still in grad school, I started Feed, the first kind of online magazine that had established writers writing for it. And really, in a way that's become a lot more common now, kind of built my writing career by publishing myself and my friends at my webzine, basically. We didn't have blogs back then, but we had web magazines. And so I sold my first book, which was Interface Culture, about technology and interfaces, kind of on the backs of my experience with Feed. So it was kind of the first generation of writers who built a career for themselves through the self-publishing mechanism of the web, which is now much more commonplace. And then at a certain point after I wrote that book, I just kind of looked at my shelf and realized the last 30 books I'd read were all science books. And that just was the direction my brain was going in. So I thought, okay, maybe I could try and do that myself. And so I wrote Emergence, which was kind of half technology, half science, half urban theory, I guess. And I loved so much this kind of moving back and forth between different disciplines, all the things that I was talking about today. And the only other thing that's interesting, I would say, about my career is that I've done these little startups while writing the books. And the startups, in a way, are kind of like the hobbies that I was talking about, right? I think of myself primarily as an author, but I love going off and starting some new web thing and actually going and hanging out with human beings and talking to them and building something together. And each startup I've done has had a direct connection to something that I was writing. In one way or another. And so Outside In, the hyperlocal service, came out of writing Ghost Map. I was writing about communities and maps and neighborhoods, and I was reading all these local bloggers in Brooklyn where I live. And truly, actually, I owe you all a thanks for this. The Google Maps API had been released, so I was writing about neighborhoods, communities, reading local bloggers, and there was this new platform of mapping that was suddenly possible. And Outside In is the intersection of those three vectors, basically. So it's, but the best thing about it is that I've been incredibly lucky that I basically get to write about whatever I'm interested in. And sometimes my publisher is like, wait, what, are you writing a book about 18th century chemistry? Like, what is going on? But most of the time they've let me just kind of do these things and kind of trusted me, which is a great gig. All right. Thank you all for coming out. It's great to see all of you, and I'm happy to sign some books. Thanks a lot.